Okay, I left off at page 9. We're reading No Bad Parts. Brief history. The mono-mind perspective, in combination with scientific and religious theories about how primitive impulses are, created a backdrop of inner polarization. One telling example comes from the influential Christian theologian John Calvin. Quote, "For our nature is not only utterly devoid of goodness, but so prolific in all kinds of evil that it can't be idle. The whole man, from the crown of the head to the sole of the foot, is so deluged, as it were, that no part remains exempt from sin, and therefore everything which proceeds from him is imputed as sin." Unquote. This is known as the doctrine of total depravity, which insists that only through the grace of God can we escape our fate of eternal damnation. Mainstream Protestantism and evangelicalism have carried some version of this doctrine for several hundred years, and the cultural impact has been widespread. With original sin, Catholicism has its own version. We can't blame this sort of thinking only on religion. Generations of philosophers and politicians have asserted that primal impulses lurk beneath the civilized veneer we present to the world. While Freud contributed important insights regarding to psyche, his drive theory was highly influential and pessimistic about human nature. It asserted that beneath the mind's surface lies selfish, aggressive, and pleasure-seeking instinctual forces that unconsciously organize our lives. Dutch historian Rutger Bregman summarizes these underlying assumptions about human nature. Quote, "The doctrine that humans are innately selfish has a hallowed tradition in the Western canon. Great thinkers like Thucydides, Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Luther, Calvin, Burke, Bentham, Nietzsche, Freud, and America's founding fathers each had their own version of the veneer theory of civilization." Unquote. Willpower and shame. The emphasis on willpower and self-control permeates American culture. We think we should be able to discipline our primitive, impulsive, sinful minds through willpower. Countless self-help books tell us it's all a matter of boosting our ability to control ourselves and develop more discipline. The concept of willpower has historical roots, namely the Victorian era, with its Christian emphasis on resisting evil impulses. The idea of taking responsibility for yourself and not making excuses is as American as apple pie. Sadly, our worship of willpower has been used by politicians and pundits to justify increasing levels of income disparity. We're taught that people are poor because they lack self-control, and that rich people are wealthy because they have self-control, despite research to the contrary. Studies show, for example, that lower income people become empowered and productive once they're given enough money to cover their basic survival needs. There's a footnote, number 4. However, the very real fact, especially considering the economic effects of pandemics, is that the rug could be pulled out from under any of us at any moment, and that threat keeps the survivalist parts of us humming. Because this willpower ethic has become internalized, we learn at an early age to shame and manhandle our unruly parts of us. We simply wrestle them into submission. One part is recruited by this cultural imperative to become our inner drill sergeant, and often becomes the nasty inner critic we love to hate. This is the voice that tries to shame us or attempt to outright get rid of parts of us that seem shameworthy. The ones that give us nasty thoughts about people, for example, or keep us addicted to substances. We often find that the harder we try to get rid of emotions and thoughts, the stronger they become. That's because parts like people fight back against being shamed or exiled. And if we do succeed in dominating them with punitive self-discipline, we often become tyrannized by that rigid, controlling inner drill sergeant. We might be disciplined, but we're not much fun. And because the exiled, binging, raging, hypersexual, etc. parts will seize any momentary weakness to break out again and take over, we have to constantly be on guard against any situations or people that might trigger those parts to come out. Jonathan Van Ness tried and failed at drug rehab several times. Growing up, quote, growing up around so much 12-step, seeing so much abstinence preached in rehab and in church, I started to take an idea that healing had to be all or nothing, which had not been my truth. I was trying to untangle sex abuse, drug abuse, and PTSD, and it was something that for me wasn't conducive to a never ever smoking weed or drinking again approach. I don't believe that once an addict, always an addict. I don't believe that addiction is a disease that warrants a life sentence. If you ever mess up or can't string a couple of months together without a slip up, you're not ruined. Unquote. There are 12-step approaches that aren't as locked into the rigid beliefs that Van Ness encountered, and the groups can be a wonderful context for people to be vulnerable and receive support. And the 12-step admonition to give everything up to a higher power can often help inner drill sergeant lighten up or even surrender. The largest point I want to make here is that any approach that increases your inner drill sergeant's impulse to shame you into behaving and make you feel like a failure if you can't will do no better in the internal family system than it does in the external one, where parents adopt shaming tactics to control their children. Don't think that this critique of willpower reveals that there's no room for inner discipline in IFS. Like children in external families, we each have parts that want things that aren't good for them or the rest of the system. And the difference here is that the self says, self with a capital S, says no to impulsive parts firmly, but from a place of love and patience, in just the same way a loving parent would. Additionally, in IFS, when parts do take over, we don't shame them. Instead, we get curious and use the parts impulse as a trailhead to find what is driving it that needs to be healed. The next part is parts aren't obstacles. We're on page 12. I'm going to end this here and we'll read this next. Thanks for listening.